part of the Brazilian left is conservative. And they don't like it when we say that. But they tried, as soon as Bolsonaro got elected in 2018, their first instinct was to blame the feminists. With saying, see, you pushed too hard. The country's conservative. The country's not ready for this. So the idea is that we're going to fight Bolsonarism by letting the Bolsonaristas be very conservative. So it makes absolutely no sense. And it's not about fighting Bolsonarism. It's about just, alternating who's in power.
The choice facing Brazilian voters on October 2nd could not be more stark. On the one hand is Jair Bolsonaro, the incumbent. He's been in charge for 4 years. He's overseen economic calamity and as many as 700,000 COVID-related deaths. Confronting him is Lula Da Silva on the left. He was in prison as recently as 3 years ago, and he was the president from 2003 to 2010. He oversaw a record period of economic expansion for the country. I spoke to Sabrina Fernandes, a Brazilian journalist, about both men and who she thinks has the best chance of winning those elections in October. Sabrina, how are you doing?
I'm good, Aaron. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you feeling ahead of the elections at the beginning of October?
Well, I'm a little hopeful, actually. A few months ago, if you had asked me, I would say I was very pessimistic, but I'm a little hopeful regarding Lula winning. We have had some good polling recently that actually gives us a shot in the first round. Maybe. And also like campaigning on the streets, a lot of the people, even though they're afraid of political violence, sometimes they're afraid of speaking about who they're going to vote for. There's a general tendency of understanding that Bolsonaro was really bad for the country. So the tendency is to go for Lula anyway.
Yeah, can you explain that one to me? Because if you look at the record of Jair Bolsonaro over the last 4 years, just as a sort of external observer, it's kind of stunning to me that he even stands a remote chance of winning. Because at least with Trump in 2020, prior to COVID, there was economic growth, high levels of employment. It wasn't just the sort of right-wing rhetoric. But then you look at Bolsonaro on COVID, on the economy, on exports, on living standards, it's a car crash. So how come he still maintains, some widespread support, at least 40%, let's say?
Yeah, the thing with Bolsonaro is that it's just not just about him. It's also about the anti-leftism sentiment in the country, especially against the PT. The work that mainstream media did in Brazil for the past more than 20 years, talking bad about the PT, associating Lula with corruption, even though Lula got out of prison because the process was found to be damning against him, that the judge had prejudice against him. A lot of people still think that, yes, he was convicted for being corrupt. And this idea around corruption is pretty strong in Brazilian culture, that politicians are going to be corrupt no matter what, but some are going to rob more than others. So I actually was taking a look at some of the TikTok trends in Brazil recently around the elections. And I found that some people were thinking that, October 2nd, basically I just have to choose between one corrupt politician and another corrupt politician. So there are some people who tend to be kind of inclined towards Bolsonaro because they think, they're all just so really bad, but, the PT was worse, because the PT was even more involved in corruption. And when you look into the trends around the speeches coming from the Bolsonaristas, the people in the Bolsonaro support base, they do a lot of manipulation around it, saying that no, Bolsonaro is actually a very correct, responsible person, and there is a lot of persecution in the media. So their main reasoning here is that Bolsonaro is just somebody who's being treated really unfairly by the newspapers. And the fact that Bolsonaro attacks journalists all the time actually adds to this.
But just for context for our audience, when I say COVID, they might think, well, everybody did poorly under COVID. Britain did badly with COVID. The United States did badly. But Brazil had 600,000 casualties as a result of COVID. How did those people, the sort of Bolsonarista stans, the super fans, how did they respond to that? Did they say that wasn't his fault as well?
Yeah, we're close to 700,000 now. Still pretty bad because there was a lot of vaccine denialism. We know that Bolsonaro delayed the vaccine getting to Brazil. We actually had an investigation going on in Parliament last year to find out what was happening around that, but in the end, it ended up not really leading anywhere, and we actually don't have access to a lot of the data and testimony anymore. So they've done a pretty good job hiding a few things here and there. There are people who just basically say that, well, it's a pandemic, people are going to die anyway. They're going to die anyway. The problem is that people died and the economy got worse because Parliament was against Bolsonaro, so was enforcing lockdown measures, was enforcing certain measures against the economy. So Bolsonaro uses that reasoning a lot. The other day here, we were talking about the increase in homelessness in Brazil. So we have about 180,000 people living in the streets right now. So this number more than doubled ever since Bolsonaro got into power. And when you talk about it, some people just say, yeah, but it's the pandemic. So you can just blame the pandemic as this abstract thing and not the way that Bolsonaro managed everything around it. And not to mention that he actually really promoted some bogus treatments that actually made things worse. And we have data connecting some of his donors to some of the private healthcare providers in Brazil, conducting tests and without people's knowledge and putting people's lives at risk when they were COVID patients because of this. So it's actually pretty nefarious.
And what's the archetypal Bolsonaro supporter? So, like in the US, people would think, well, it's somebody in the Midwest, have a Bible in one hand, a gun in the other. I mean, that's the kind of parody of the Republican core voter. But who's the core voter for Bolsonaro, both demographically but also geographically?
Yeah, we have a couple of profiles. So you can think of like the very hardcore, loyal person in Bolsonaro's base. You're talking about someone from middle class with traditional conservative values. This idea that's really promoting Brazil being like the good citizen, cidadão de bem. So no, I pay my taxes, and I believe in meritocracy, and people shouldn't be taxing more than they already are. And I should have the right to own a gun to protect my family because Brazil is a very violent country, and women should be at home or they should be very submissive towards their husbands. And this is something that Bolsonaro is really playing to lately, using his wife alongside him, Michelle Bolsonaro, talking about this role model of a Christian wife. So these Christian values, they're very important here. We have to understand that Brazil is a very Christian country, more traditionally a Catholic country, but in the past years, evangelical Protestantism has grown in the country, and in the more conservative line, almost fundamentalist line, we have these mega churches with these pastors have gotten super rich over the past years, also under Lula and Dilma. So this is something to mention, that the evangelical issue is something that the left doesn't know how to handle. The moderate left doesn't know how to handle it. The more radical left, revolutionary left, doesn't know how to handle it. This is something very much of a problem right now. And
what do you mean by doesn't know how to handle it? They don't know how to handle the arguments those people make or the interests they represent?
It's just that the evangelical crowd is actually a lot more diverse than people think. And when we consider then when the Workers' Party was created, and we think of the landless workers movement, we think of this democratic left that arose in Brazil at the end of the dictatorship in the 80s and got more institutional and more well-known in the 90s. It's a left that was very much connected to liberation theology. They were quite connected to this idea that, yes, you could be a Christian, but it could also be fighting for emancipation. And throughout the years, because the fundamentalist side of things really grew in a way of like controlling women's bodies, being very LGBTQ phobic, and bringing in these ideas that are very anti-communist to the side, we feel like the left wasn't prepared to actually make a counterpoint to that. So you either find two things. You're going to find, for example, Dilma Rousseff going to the launch of this huge temple here in São Paulo by one of the most conservative churches. That's actually a mega church. The main pastor, bishop, is one of Brazil's biggest billionaires and a media mogul. And she goes and she says, well, blessed is the country whose Lord is God. So she gives into this. So they started giving into this for a while. And on the other hand, you're going to find part of the left saying that we should blame the evangelicals for everything. So they reject those who are working with liberation theology and end up failing to provide a more of a historical materialist analysis of the situation, which is the fact that a huge part of the working class is evangelical today. People who are really poor, who are going through precarious conditions, whose lives have gotten much worse under Bolsonaro, and they tend to go towards what the pastor is saying, or understanding that, well, God will provide and Bolsonaro is a man of God. Bolsonaro has been dedicating his schedule mostly to evangelical connections. His attendance to the Queen's funeral in the UK was together with Silas Malafaia, one of the main fundamentalist pastors in Brazil. So he's really associated with these people. So when the left doesn't understand that part of Bolsonaro base is not just this very angry person, maybe with fascist ideals, but also people who are in the working class, who feel very disadvantaged right now in Brazil and have devoted their lives, their faith, their hopes into this idea that we need to have this man, this Christian man who's going to help us with the vision of God. And I trust my pastor because my pastor helps me when things are not going well in my life. If we just reject that, we're rejecting a huge part of the Brazilian working class, and we'll keep feeding into Bolsonarism by default because we're not actually politicizing the situation.
And what the left just kind of, or a lot of the left just dismisses that as kind of false consciousness rather than try and create a political account for it. And also, by extension, where does that come from, that growth in evangelical Christianity over the last 20, 30 years? Just as a side note, you mentioned historical materialism.
Yes, there's when we look into this, it's a quite powerful of a project because it involves opening up churches everywhere. Some of these evangelical churches have this idea of let's replace every bar on the corner of a block with a church. And if you go around some cities, it actually looks true. Because you could go down streets and you're going to find a lot of these mini churches throughout, and some mega churches in particular locations. And what really helped them was the idea of opening these mini churches in the more marginal parts of the cities, in the outskirts where the poorer working class is. And when you have this tendency, when you have like an economic crisis and people are feeling more abandoned by the state, and austerity measures come in, it's also an opportunity for these pastors to say, hey, come in, we can embrace you. This cannot be detached, however, to the power of these media enterprises and the amount of money that has gone into this. So when we talk, for example, about Macedo, who's one of these billionaires who owns one of the major Brazilian television networks here, he's not the only one. A lot of these churches, they used to do these funding drives with offerings and tithes to get people to say, we need to have a program on TV, or we need to buy our own private television cable network. And a lot of them did that. We have churches who started founding schools. So we can have like our own children. We always go to these kind of schools. You look into the Macedo, and he's actually responsible for a ridiculous amount of community radio shows and radio enterprises in Brazil. And we have to understand that even though the internet is pretty strong in the country nowadays, it's not 100%. We still have a lot of failure in terms of coverage. So sometimes when we analyze Bolsonarism, we're talking about the fake news and WhatsApp, and this is all very important. But radio is key because people are listening to the radio, taxi drivers, Uber drivers, when you look into housekeepers, because this is still very much a country with this colonial legacy or having housekeepers who are black from the periphery of the cities, and they spend the entire days listening to radio. And there's a tendency of having conservative radio because of that. So we cannot detach this from just thinking that, well, they did a really good job bringing people in and the country is already very Christian. There is a project that's quite similar to some of the things that we know that they have learned directly from the US televangelists. So this idea of like getting the crowds riled up and being on television and opening huge churches and everyone comes in. So prosperity gospel being a huge part of this discourse. And I think in a country of dependent capitalism where like we don't actually develop, everything is still very much running with a deficit the whole time. If you get these meritocratic feelings into people's heads and you put that together with prosperity gospel and people feel like they're chosen ones, this is a way of actually like capturing emotions, effects, and it has worked quite well.
So the analogy to the US is really interesting and it makes lots of sense what you're saying there. But I suppose what interests me is the situation of Brazil after the 2008 crisis is actually quite unique because you have a progressive government, you have reducing inequality. I mean, it's very, very, very rare historically to have a growing economy, but also reducing inequality, which is what happens with Lula. We'll talk about that more later. And then after 2008, slowly but surely, that growth model just disintegrates, particularly after 2012, it just collapses. So I suppose the question then is, given what you just said there, are those the primary sort of social beneficiaries of the demise of the old growth model? So you haven't got runaway rocketing growth like you do, say, from 2000 to 2012. And as a result, people turn to prosperity gospel, evangelical Christianity. Or does this turn go further back to the 1990s? So like with Pat Robertson in the United States, for instance?
No, like prosperity gospel has been around like from before. So like when Lula got into power, when things started growing, we had like programs for fighting hunger and life was improving because of social programs. We already had this boom in the churches, this idea of sending missionaries everywhere. We have to understand that some of these Brazilian churches, they're also responsible for creating havoc in parts of Africa, other parts of Latin America. There's a growth in some of these churches in Venezuela, in Chile, in Colombia. So they're quite present in other parts of the world right now. And this project started way back. What is interesting, though, is that once this commodity boom that was helping Lula manage the crisis and Lula comes in, they find this opportunity to create also some moral panics. So it's not just about the economic crisis, but this manipulation of moral panics that was quite strong under Dilma Rousseff. Because, for example, one of the things that we're still managing here in Brazil today is this whole conversation around a project for the schools to fight homophobia, LGBTQ phobia in general. So teaching children to be more tolerant. And this was before fake news was a proper thing. This was already going around in Brazil as something that, look, is the leftists, the communists, always like claiming that the PT is a communist because anti-communism was always part of this. They're trying to indoctrinate our children to become gay. And then the pastors start using that. So this trend of the prosperity gospel was also always very conservative in the sense of telling women, like I have like firsthand of experience here because I grew up in that scenario, attending those churches, and some of these pastors who are really powerful today that I grew up listening to them, like I grew up listening to Silas Malafaia, for example, my mother would take me to his touring. He would do a tour of the country and crowds would come and they would always talk about the role of women in society and what a good Christian marriage is. And after a while, they started importing other things from the US in terms of like, you have to wait for sex after marriage, or you have to wait to even kiss only after marriage. And like, they would translate these books from the US and publish it in Brazil. So this conservatism found a way back into this colonial strain in Brazilian society that's very patriarchal, that was starting to change because you had the Black movement making advances, you had the LGBTQ movement and the feminists making advancements. So they decided that, well, we need to push back. And the left was also not very prepared for this, because we have been listening. This is still a problem, actually, that then the feminists should just be quiet. Because if you talk too much about abortion rights, you get the evangelicals riled up, and then Bolsonaro wins. So this idea that we need to step back so we won't be provoking them, when we actually know that every time we step back, they made more room for themselves. They made some very particular gains, and this is why the moral panics, they're quite strong, and Bolsonaro has been able to manage it quite well. And I think that under the Dilma Rousseff government, one of the problems that we had was that rather than pushing for some of these programs, she gave in. So she gave in her second term in terms of austerity, thinking that was going to appease parliament, appease the right wing and the neoliberals in general. But she also thought that it would be better to appease the fundamentalist evangelical leaders, and kind of turned her back to some of these demands because of this.
So for somebody who's unacquainted with sort of Brazilian political history, they would know there was the coup in the 1960s, and that the problem with Bolsonaro is there are political appeals to the dictatorship in the past and militarism and so on and so forth. But what you're describing here actually is something far closer to the United States, which is there is a social and cultural revolution from below in terms of LGBT rights, in terms of Black civil rights, in terms of economic and social equality. And then what we see really over the last several decades is an attempted counter-revolution to that. Am I being overly simplistic to say actually that Brazil's situation and Bolsonaro, for instance, maps on quite well to what we see with the kind of Republican counter-revolution to the 1960s that we often hear about in the United States?
Well, we have to understand that one of the biggest figures of this conservative wave in Brazil was Olavo de Carvalho, who died earlier this year in January. He was a guru to Bolsonaro. He was someone who was a prolific communicator. So ever since YouTube was along, he started putting videos on YouTube and selling courses, and people calling him professor. And what a very interesting thing about Olavo de Carvalho's writings, that a lot of this was like straightforward plagiarism of William Lind from the US. So attacking for this is something that always caught my attention, that Olavo de Carvalho will be attacking Marcusa in Brazil a lot, when Marcusa wasn't being read and nobody knew who Marcusa was, right? But Marcusa was a main figure in the US during that time. So William Lind would make these accusations around talking about errors in civilization as a book that's always promoting orgies and the decay of society and the decay of values. And Olavo de Carvalho would say the same things about Marcusa here, but Marcusa wasn't really being discussed that much beyond some academic niches or some very specific socialist niches. But the idea was to create this panic that there is cultural Marxism and they're coming for your children. So this, like, ideologically, we can find very, very big parallels here, certainly, because we know that got imported. This idea of having cultural Marxism infiltrating the schools, infiltrating our lives, our families, and you have to be aware of the communists. This was imported directly in some circumstances. And then we find that this was coupled with resentment towards very specific economic policies as well. So when we talk about the advancements of the Black movement, the unified Brazilian Black movement, Movimento Negro Unificado, was very strong in the fight for democracy, coming out from the dictatorship, fighting for democracy. And one of the main demands was making sure that Black people could properly attend university in this country. And one of these demands that finally got tended to by the Lula government was around affirmative action. So creating quotas to make sure that Black students could get in. We have a system that's very exclusive here in Brazil, We have, just so the audience is aware of this, we have like a public and a private university system. In the public, you don't pay anything. In the private, you pay, but the public is actually the more prestigious one and is much harder to get in. So creating these affirmative action programs for Black and poor students to get in, these added to this resentment in the middle classes and the upper classes that, well, I've been paying private schooling for my children my entire life so they can get into public university, and now these people are getting in much easier than they are. So that's something that connects economic policies around public investment into the educational system with this resentment around identity politics, around these movements who are, infiltrating with their culture, and that gets into a lot of the racist paradigm in Brazil that's very, very, very strong around Black culture, Black lives, where Black people live. So we cannot detach this from this very strong history of racism that we have in the country as well.
You mentioned Olavo. I know we're talking about the Brazilian elections, and I think most of our audience, but who the hell are you talking about? I first came across this guy reading a book about quote unquote traditionalists, and it was about Alexander Dugin and obviously Steve Bannon, and Olavo found himself there too. So can you talk about some of the sort of when I say relationships, these aren't purely intellectual relationships. These people were talking to one another, meeting one another. So can you talk about the relationships between the likes of Olavo, Dugin, Steve Bannon?
Yeah, well, what's very interesting here is that we have a tendency, and something that we actually have to emphasize a lot, to think that it's all a big coincidence, right? That you have this like new wave of conservative countries and the conservative governments, and they're all making their way in, but they're not really talking to each other. But we know that Steve Bannon provided training in Brazil on how to deal with social media here. And Olavo de Carvalho, being the pioneer that he was, present absolutely everywhere and like with very, very loyal followers, was part of this, because a lot of these videos they started getting sent through WhatsApp streams. Those were Olavo de Carvalho's videos. And Olavo de Carvalho helped to inspire a new generation of far-right YouTubers that we have been dealing with. So when I started on YouTube back in 2017, I was maybe the second or the third like properly leftist YouTuber back then. Everything else was about like right-wing YouTubers, and they had millions of followers. So they had networks, they provided training to each other. They did partnerships, collaborations. They would talk about, reference each other in talks, in writing. So there's a lot of like the intellectual relationship is quite real here, but it also connects to these funding streams and these streams around the use of technologies. Mostly media technologies on how to get across. But something that's very clear, for example, if you talk about like Carvalho and Dugin together, is like these appeals to like these old patriarchal values. Like this very strong conservatism on like the role of man and what is a strong man in society. And in a country like Brazil, that resonates very easily, because it is already a very patriarchal country. It is a country that even the feminist movement tries to organize itself, but hasn't made some of the advances that the feminist movement has made in Argentina, in Chile, in Colombia, for example. So we are certainly behind in that sense. And one of the things about Olavo de Carvalho is that he was very good at conspiracy theories. And I think that's something that helped with the Bannon techniques. Because we do know that one of the things about the conspiracy theories is that once they're out there, you can try to do all the fact-checking you want. The fact-checking won't go as far. In the past few years, we've learned to understand that the best way to fight fake news in this country is to preview them, properly analyze and see this is something that they're going to work on. They're going to create things around this. So we need to start educating people around this. And we're currently dealing with a situation around a deep fake, a very good deep fake that is going around in the Bolsonarista circles this week. That claims that one of the the most recent polls was putting Bolsonaro targeted to win in the first round. And Bolsonaro actually said in an interview in the UK that he did, I think, right after he did his whole photo shoot around the funeral and things like that, that he said that if he doesn't win in the first round with a 60% lead, something really weird is happening in these elections. So signaling that probably there's a fraud. But we have to be quite honest. Every single poll that we've had in this country has put Bolsonaro in the second place in the polling. And even in the second round, always in second place. So he's using two tactics right now. And one is to claim that the polls have no legitimacy. And the Secretary of Communications was actually accusing one of these big polling agencies yesterday of being fraudulent and saying that, these people should probably be arrested after the elections if Bolsonaro doesn't win, because they're trying to influence the outcome. And at the same time, they did a deep fake claiming that the same poll was a poll that was saying that Bolsonaro was going to win in the first round. And it's a deep fake using the anchor from the main news show in Brazil, using William Bonner here. And but the thing is that we spent the past 3 to 4 months educating people on what deep fakes are. So this helps. It's not going to fix the whole problem, but people were already aware that deep fakes are a thing, so we should be watching out for them. So I think we're slightly better nowadays than we were in 2018, dealing with these technological surprises coming from the right, but we still have a long way to go.
On Olavo, quickly, again, I feel on these conversations around Putin and Trump and so on, when people refer to sort of fascism, I do feel it doesn't quite capture just how nutty these people are, particularly Olavo. I mean, Dugin as well, right? Dugin, for instance, doesn't think that chemistry and mathematics should be taught in schools. Like, completely reactionary people. Like, they would like to turn the clock back several centuries.
But Aaron, what scares me here is that Dugin is having some influence in some radical left circles in Brazil right now. Because, like I said, this is absolutely bizarre. It's bizarre. But we have a very conservative country, and we have been discussing this new rise in Marxist incels, and who just hate women. Absolutely. And the language that they use, and they're present on 4chan, and they're doing these things, and they're talking about revolution. And some of these guys, because there are guys, and some of these guys have been praising Dugin a lot, especially after the invasion in Ukraine. So Dugin is becoming a little bit of a replacement girl, and he's part of some of these far right conversations. But we have now some people who consider themselves to be socialists or communists saying that, well, maybe Dugin is not so bad. He has some good points. You just have to filter through it. And then when you look into more private conversations, they actually say, no, but yeah, because identity politics, cultural Marxism is a problem. We need real Marxism. That's absolutely scary to me.
And who would those people vote for? Would they be voting for Lula still?
Yeah, they would vote for Lula still. So this is the strange mix that we have, but it makes sense in when we consider that part of the Brazilian left is conservative, and they don't like it when we say that. But they tried, as soon as Bolsonaro got elected in 2018, their first instinct was to blame the feminists, with saying, "See, you pushed too hard. The country is conservative. The country is not ready for this." So the idea is that we're going to fight Bolsonarism by letting the Bolsonaristas be very conservative. So it makes absolutely no sense, and it's not about fighting Bolsonarism. It's about just alternating who's in power.
You mentioned the polls a moment ago, and like you say, in all of the polls, Lula Da Silva comes first in the first round. He wins in the second round by varying sort of margins. I think we put out a poll today on Novara. The most recent one has him winning by 5% in the first round, 10% in the second round, so bigger than the margin of error. The Bolsonaro camp says that these are wrong, and that they point to larger crowds than Lula da Silva on the ground. Do you think there's any countervailing evidence to suggest that maybe the polls aren't 100% accurate? Obviously, we saw that with Trump. We've seen it with the 2017 election in this country. There's that silent voter who doesn't necessarily show up on the data, but then on the day they go and cast their ballot for the more conservative candidate. Do you think that could be a phenomenon here?
I think in Brazil is that we have mandatory voting, and we've have had it for a really long time. So people show up. People show up. And people show up even if it is to just spoil their ballot, right? We have the electronic ballot system, so they'll put some random number, they'll annul, or they'll vote blank, but they will show up generally. So because of this, it's much easier to trust the polling system than, for example, right now in Chile, where even though the rejection of the new constitution was posited to win in this polling, nobody predicted that the gap would be so wide, right? That rejection would win by 62%. Why? Because this was the first time that Chileans were going to be obliged to vote, precisely in this occasion. In Brazil, this is already part of our culture. We understand that we need to vote. Very few people don't go to vote, and when they don't, it's more of this crisis representation, and this is usually allocated in the margin of error. What we've had in the past is, for example, in the polling, underestimating the amount of spoiled ballots. That like people would just go and spoil the ballot, but not so much underestimating who would vote for each candidate. Usually, like the last 2 weeks before the round, a lot of the people who are undecided, they finally make up their minds, and that's why this kind of polling right before each round is crucial here. So I think we are well positioned in to get like Lula strong into the second round. I think the polling around that Lula making to the like winning in the first round, that relies too much on the margin of error, relies too much on some expectations around the undecided. So it would be excellent if Lula won in the first round, because the second round will be vicious. The second round is something that we know is going to be worse in terms of the political violence that we already see in the streets, the general feeling around fear. People are afraid to say they're going to vote for. So the level of threats have increased. We have Bolsonaristas who are heavily armed nowadays, because one of the feats of Bolsonaro was to issue a lot of decrees for guns and making gun access a lot easier in the country. After many years ago, Lula was one of the responsible ones for, disarming the country. So like he actually made like a 180% degree change in that matter. And now even the armed forces in Brazil, they say they don't know how many guns are in circulation. And when Bolsonaristas are threatening people, they're threatening like showing that they have guns in their pockets, under their belts. And it's true that Bolsonaro has a good mobilizing power in the streets because he has this very strong loyal base. But I don't think this is enough to justify a change in voting, because it's different the way Bolsonaro mobilizes from the way the left mobilizes. And the main difference here is that the left spent the past 20 years demobilizing itself, trusting so much in these institutions, and the Workers' Party is one of the responsible ones for this. I spent years writing articles for Jacobin, like complaining about how the Workers' Party was demobilizing its own base, and this was going to have some very bad consequences. And one of the main consequences was this inability to actually rally support for Dilma when Dilma was being attacked and when the coup was being orchestrated in parliament. And even Dilma herself nowadays, when she gives interviews, she talks about how the Workers' Party didn't do a good job in a counter-coup campaign, mobilizing people. It got too comfortable. It got too comfortable with institutions. So Lula is strong. We have too much personalism in the country. This idea that some people that saying that Lula can't be criticized at all, that the program is perfect, that we should just let this guy win and govern the country because he knows what he does. So it's like God in heaven, Lula on earth. It's a bad way of handling things because it is depoliticizing. It is even bad for Lula himself in terms of dealing with the contradictions that he's going to have to deal with, because he's running on a super broad left, not even leftist front. He's running on a super broad front. His VP candidate is someone from the traditional right in Brazil. He was governor of São Paulo for many years, of the state of São Paulo. And his military police was particularly known for like beating up teachers and like people who were protesting. So Alckmin is disliked by part of the left. So Lula made sure to have a super broad front to win, but when you have such a broad front, it also means that once you get into power, you're going to have to negotiate so many opposing interests. And he's well known for being a very apt politician, very skilled in terms of handling these interests. But we also know that sometimes he tends to, favor those who are already in power as long as he can keep his social programs. So in terms of the class struggle in Brazil, he just keeps managing the class struggle in the way that it's convenient for capital until an economic crisis hits and they need to get rid of them again and bring in like a stronger neoliberal program.
Would he be looking to settle any scores if he took power? Because obviously he was in prison until 3 years ago. A lot of people tried to destroy him. And obviously he is looking right now at the prospect of the highest elected office in the country. So would he be looking to get his own back? Is that a fear that is kind of pervasive amongst conservative elites? Or would he let bygones be bygones? Because like you say, his nature is to be seeking compromise and consensus.
He's very Republican. Lula is a very Republican kind of politician, and he's always saying that I'm going to work with whoever wants to work with me. And we know that, for example, the candidate who's in the third place, Ciro Gomes, who's getting closer and closer to Bolsonarista discourse, because the whole idea behind the Ciro Gomes campaign, who comes from a traditional labor party in Brazil, is like blaming, or like there's a conservative tendency there as well, but it's also saying that the PT, the Workers' Party, they're attached to power. If they could get out, I could be president of the country. And he's like consistently around like 6 to 8%. Like he has no chance. But if his voters migrated to Lula could win in the first round. But rather than making that adjustment, understanding that maybe the country shouldn't go through a second round, maybe it will be easier to fight, the more extreme tendencies in the Bolsonaro's base, political violence, threat of a coup. If I went with Lula in the first round, he's very keen on comparing Lula and Bolsonaro as if they were one and the same. And like playing to this horseshoe theory of like, these are the extremes. I'm the more grounded option here. And this is something that is infuriating a lot of people in the left. But Lula is someone who will probably even give like Ciro Gomes a ministry if necessary, even though the guy is attacking him consistently. In fact, Ciro Gomes was a minister in the past in the sector of education. So Lula is willing to compromise a lot. I don't think he wouldn't compromise, for example, with Judge Sérgio Moro, the one who was responsible for putting him in prison. Obviously, I think there are some limits there. But in the center to the left, it would be okay. In terms of Bolsonaro, Lula has mentioned, for example, maybe lifting some of the secret decrees around Bolsonaro spending, what his sons were doing in the presidential palace all the time. So there are some threats around there. And we do know that Bolsonaro is afraid of being arrested once he's no longer in power. So he's talked about retiring from politics sometimes, and sometimes he says that he's only getting out of the presidency, arrested or killed. So it varies a little, yeah.
Typical Jair Bolsonaro understatement.
Yes.
So The Economist is backing Lula, which I find really interesting. But that kind of tallies with what you're saying about, well, he's quite a useful instrument for the ruling class because he can pacify class conflict. And, after all, he was at the top of the tree when the country saw sort of really economically dynamic period. What do you make of that? I mean, and do you think that sort of weakens the long-term prospects for progressive change in Brazil? The fact that you do have somebody who's seeking consensus, who's a pacifier, and at the same time, you've got the agenda setting, you've got the big ideas coming from outside the left.
Yeah, so we have, when we think of the economists with Lula, you could think of like Mercadante, who's been traditionally with Lula with a really long time, has more of a developmentalist approach to things. So these are the investments that we have to make. But just now, this week, one of the main encounters of like this is the broad front that's standing with Lula. We had Henrique Meirelles there, who represents like a very neoliberal standpoint. Um, big on austerity, and we know this has been one of the issues with the PTs, thinking that you can please everyone at the same time. Lula is very proud, and he says it a lot of times. He's been saying this up until now, that never in the history of this country had like big farmers and banks had made as much money as they did under me. So he says that as a very, very good thing, because please don't be afraid of me. And when Lula got elected the first time back in 2002, something that was quite key to that moment was this letter that got published in the newspapers, like the letter to the Brazilian people, basically saying we're not going to default on our debts. We're going to be fiscally responsible. So at that time, like we used to, like I was still very young back then, but later on, I used to like look into what people were saying about this, and it's like, oh, letter to the Brazilian people or letter to the Brazilian banks. So this is part of this project of class conciliation, and Lula hates the term. Like every time that we say like there's class conciliation, here's like, no, that's not what I'm doing. I'm just like working with the best parts to help the country. This has gotten into a little touch of post-politics in the campaign. So like he said at one point that his campaign is neither left nor right. It's for the good of Brazil, which is worrisome. But at the same time, the campaign itself has a very leftist approach, because you have the landless workers movement. You have discourses that are about improving the lives of the working class that the right would never use. So the leftist touch is there, but he's really trying to grab the attention of, the center right, capitalist voter and ally, even in the Brazilian capitalist class as well. And part of the capitalist class in Brazil is absolutely fine with Lula coming back. They think Lula is reasonable, which Bolsonaro was not. So it's easier to deal with him. And like some of the more modern capitalist class in Brazil likes that. So we can mention, for example, one of the billionaires, Luiza Trajano, who owns one of the biggest retail chains in Brazil. She was even quoted to be Lula's VP for a while. Like there were these rumors that she could be the VP. So there's this tendency to play along. What is key here is what this means in terms of lifting the austerity ceiling that we're living under right now. So after the coup against Dilma Rousseff, we had this interim government with Temer, who was his VP, her VP. And the thing with Temer was that we had a lot of counter reforms back then, and one of them was connected to this ceiling of 20 years on government spending. And this is one of the reasons life has really decayed over the past years, not only just under Bolsonaro. So if we don't lift that ceiling, and this is going to require a lot of skill in terms of the executive, but also how Lula deals with the legislative in Brazil, he's not going to be able to do much. He's mentioned, for example, that he might just ignore the ceiling, because that might be necessary, but it's not enough to ignore the ceiling. We actually have to lift the ceiling, because we're talking about a legacy of decades. So this has to be addressed immediately. And he's gone back and forth on this. He says it's important, and then he kind of goes soft, doesn't talk about it for a while. And this alliance of economists is something that might be worrisome. And definitely we need to get the left mobilizing again in Brazil to pressure to lift the ceiling once and for all.
And what's the conversation amongst the sort of the upper echelons of the PT and Lula's kind of retinue with regards to growth? Because of course, like you say, he comes to power in 2002, he leaves power a decade later, and actually, well, between 2002, 2008, 9, there is this golden Goldilocks period of global growth. You have this commodity boom, like you say, in Brazil, but you just have global growth's really high. China has higher growth than it does today. India does. The US does. The EU does. Britain does. Everybody does. So that growth model, actually uniquely of all the major economies, helped to pay for expanding social welfare. Like I say, you have growth, but you also have declining inequality. But that growth model's gone. Is that part of the conversation amongst the PET? Because of course it's relatively easy to give money to low-income households when you have economic growth. We had it with Blairism in the UK, for instance. The problem is when you don't have the City of London generating all those corporate tax receipts, you don't have banks, employing lots of people and generating lots of profits which you can tax, then actually that question of redistribution and social justice outcomes is a lot more difficult. Is that part of the conversation with the people around Lula?
Lula is still betting on some of the old pillars, but they're a little updated now. So let me give some examples here. Unemployment got really bad the past years. Now it's softening a little again. And Lula is really big on creating jobs. So the way that he knows how to do that is by investing directly into infrastructure, big programs for creating jobs throughout the country, using the state as a machine to finance certain sectors. So, well, like we have like a national bank. That's one of the tools that Lula can use for this. Public-private partnerships, trying to attract particular types of investment, but also investing in South-South cooperation partnerships in Latin America. BRICS is a huge thing that Lula wants to invest back into right now. He's really still betting on the pre-salt oil layer in Brazil as being something that is going to push the country in more income. But this runs into a contradiction with his own political program, because the pressure in the past years around Bolsonaro and the destruction of nature in Brazil, climate denialism, being used as a way to actually build a whole scheme around carbon credits through the environmental ministry, and the fact that like you have deforestation of the Amazon, but also destruction of every single biome in the country. There's been a lot of pressure in that sense. So Lula's program talks about energy transition, like multiple times, talks about ecological transition. That's quite interesting. But at the same time, when you interview Lula or Lula's in a debate, it's almost like pre-salt layer is going to save us. So there's quite a difficulty in terms of dealing with what the transition would look like. And that sometimes what he means is not transition, is diversification. This is one of the concerns. So we want Petrobras, our company, national oil company, to be fully public. This is important because we know that if it's not fully public, we're never going to transition. So it needs to become an energy company. And now, like the coordinator of the main workers union at Petrobras talks about Petrobras becoming Solarbras. This creates the feeling around transition. But when Lula talks about it, it's mostly around diversification, because there's this whole idea that the royalties from oil is going to save us, because we can invest into the educational sector and we can invest in healthcare with those royalties. So there's some traditional approaches there. And this is going to run into, he's going to run into a lot of conflicts around this. There's pressure in the country and the region to think of what a Latin American Green New Deal could look like. We have Petro in Colombia pushing for phasing out fossil fuel investments in the region. Boric in Chile with a more ecological approach too. So there's going to be some pressure coming from outside as well. I know Lula is a big player here, and what we're actually wondering is that if the things that are being put into the program around transition and maybe what green growth could look like when Lula actually talks about growth and the creation of green jobs, if this could actually put Brazil in a position to lead the region, being such a massive country with such a massive economy, leading the region in these matters alongside these other players. And or like AMLO in Mexico talking about nationalization of lithium. So there's enough of a conversation going, but we're afraid that like Lula might just give in because he's still attached to these older approaches around developmentalism that we know haven't really worked in the country before. It can secure some gains for a while, but for example, we a lot of the hydro dams that were built under Lula and under Dilma, that were these partnerships with construction companies that would get concessions to run these dams for a while. This was not enough to actually deal with some other demands around energy democracy in the country, deal with demands around transition, got too comfortable thinking that while we have hydro dams, that's renewables for us, so we can keep exploiting oil. So a lot of things in terms of the paradigms around extractivism in the country, this is something that is going to have to be confronted. We have social movements that are well positioned to do that. We have the indigenous movements very vocal nowadays about, putting the finger right into Lula's face and saying, we don't want another Belo Monte dam. We don't want that kind of development program anymore. So this is going to be one of the main challenges, like what it means to grow the country, position itself well again in terms of geopolitics and economically in the region, but doing this within another paradigm. And I'm not so sure. Like, I think there are elements in the program of Lula that are quite advanced, but when you actually talk to Lula about it, he's still repeating the old things. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect here, like a mismatch between what's in the program and what Lula himself thinks about it. So we're going to have to find out like who's going to win. The people who, like the big coalition who wrote this program and put all of these things around transition and new jobs connected to a new kind of economy in Brazil, or these more traditional approaches that Lula is still very attached to.
That is so interesting. I have one more question. Do you think that Jair Bolsonaro will accept defeat if that's what happens in the polls come October?
It really depends on what his base is willing to do, and it depends on geopolitics. So I'm going to talk first about the base here. We know, like you mentioned, the Nazi elements of these guys, right? We know that ever since Bolsonaro got into power, the number of Nazi cells have grown in Brazil. Like, we have data on this. Like, not just like people claiming they're Nazis, but organized Nazis. This is very worrisome, also because they're armed. So there's this risk of political violence, of his base just going wild and doing things. He does that whole dog whistle kind of thing of like, if we lose, you know what to do. If you won't say anything in particular, you know what to do. So this is something that worries us, but at the same time, we don't think that Bolsonaro has enough of an institutional backing to remain power. Like, he's changed his approach to the US after Biden. In the beginning, he would say he didn't recognize Biden as the winner of the election, but then they got together again, Summit of the Americas, the same old of the traditional US imperialism in Latin America. They work with whoever is in power, right? So Bolsonaro got a little bit of a wiggle room there, but we don't think US institutions will back a Bolsonaro coup. We don't think the OAS would back a Bolsonaro coup, and the OAS would be key, like it was in the Bolivian coup, right? So there's the armed forces. In the case of the armed forces, there are splits. We have a crazy amount of military people within the civilian part of the Brazilian government nowadays, like over 6,000 military people occupying civilian positions. So they're very well positioned in many strategic areas. Bolsonaro obviously is always running with a military VP. So you have Mourão, you have Braga Neto, you have military ministers, but also the armed forces. They have a tendency that, like, as long as our lives are okay, like, to take care of us, we have like good pensions and good salaries. We don't want too much trouble. We don't want too much trouble. So there are splits in the armed forces here. Like, we need to talk about the what we think, like, what there's a military power operating here, and this military power sometimes operates as this covert military party, like under Bolsonaro, but also some of the military leadership, they don't want extra trouble. We had a case last year of the three heads of the armed forces in Brazil resigning all at once because they thought Bolsonaro was just going insane. Like Bolsonaro was asking the Air Force in Brazil to just fly these pilot jets very, very low on the ground, close to the Supreme Court, to blow up the windows of the Supreme Court. So this is the Air Force head at the time. Like he resigned, the others resigned, so we had this like replacement all at once. And months later, he came on the interview saying, "This is the reason I resigned." Because this guy has a problem with the Supreme Court. He's attacking the Supreme Court the whole time. So there's a split in the institutions here that would make Bolsonaro's job a lot harder. And we know the world is watching. And because, Trump is no longer there, there's been some changes here and there, including in Latin America, right? So like it's no longer Piñera in Chile, it's no longer Macri in Argentina. Colombia got rid of Duque, so there was the defeat of the coup in Bolivia. Almolo, despite impeachment attempts, kind of keeping stable in Mexico. So Bolsonaro doesn't have enough of an ally in the region, and certainly Guaido in Venezuela is not going to help him.
That is really, really insightful. So just to quickly recap, you think that Lula will win, and you don't think there'll be a coup. I guess we'll find out after October 2nd.
I hope I'm right.
I hope so too. Thanks so much, Sabrina.
Thanks, Aaron.
Cheers.